My rich brother told everyone I was broke. The bank manager corrected him. My rich brother told an entire private dining room that I was broke, while the bank manager was standing directly behind him with documents requiring my signature to keep his company alive. I remember the moment clearly because humiliation sharpens ordinary details. The room, the light, and the expressions around me all became fixed in memory. What looked small to everyone else felt like a verdict on who I was allowed to become. I did not have the language to challenge that verdict yet, so I watched, listened, and stored the truth. The manager waited until the laughter faded, then asked everyone to make room for the beneficial owner of the fund holding Preston's debt. Preston raised a glass and described me as the family charity project. I wrote the information down before speaking to anyone. That habit protected me from the subtle revisions that followed every confrontation. When a date later shifted or a promise became a misunderstanding, I could return to what had actually happened. The record did not make the situation less painful, but it prevented pain from being used to erase precision. I returned to bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Our family had treated Preston as a financial prodigy since he sold a software company at 28. That detail mattered more than it seemed. In my family, and in every institution surrounding us, appearances were often accepted before facts. Once a convenient version of me had been repeated, people treated my reaction as the problem and the original cruelty as background noise. I began learning that silence protects the person who controls the story, not the person trying to survive it. I worked in risk management, lived in the same modest townhouse for 12 years, and rarely explained where my income went. He bought visible things, appeared in magazines, and measured every gathering by who noticed his watch or car. The practical effect reached beyond that day. It changed where I lived, how I worked, and which relationships felt safe. I became more careful without becoming cold. Caution and bitterness are not the same thing. Caution asks for consistency before trust expands. Bitterness assumes consistency is impossible. I wanted a life built on the first, not imprisoned by the second. The clearest protection remained in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. After our father died, Preston began paying for family vacations and attaching loyalty to every invitation. I did not respond dramatically. Years of being underestimated had taught me that anger was easiest to dismiss when it arrived before evidence. Instead, I noticed dates, names, and the order in which people changed their explanations. My restraint was not weakness. It was the beginning of a record that would eventually become harder to ignore than any rumor. Silence was easier than turning every dinner into an audit. I declined expensive trips when the schedule did not suit me and was described as unable to afford them. I spoke with people who had no investment in protecting the approved version of events. Their questions were simple and therefore revealing. Who benefited? Who signed? Who had access? What changed afterward? Each answer stripped away another layer of sentiment. The situation became less mysterious as soon as I stopped treating ordinary misconduct as a private misunderstanding no outsider could examine. I kept bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved the financial independence I had built quietly. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. My own career moved from commercial banking into distressed debt analysis. At the time, I still believed fairness would appear if I explained myself carefully enough. I thought a complete sentence, a clean document, or one honest witness could make people choose decency. The harder lesson was that some people understand perfectly and continue anyway because confusion benefits them. Once I accepted that, my decisions became clearer and much less apologetic. I founded Harbor Slate Capital through a structure that kept my name out of marketing materials and forced every decision through documented criteria. A group of pension funds later asked me to create an independent vehicle for patient investment in regional businesses. That was when fear became useful. Instead of letting it circle inside me, I turned it into a checklist. I preserved files, changed passwords, requested certified copies, and wrote down every contact. Action did not eliminate uncertainty, but it gave uncertainty boundaries. Within those boundaries, I could think clearly enough to recognize choices that panic had hidden. Each review of bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Harbor Slate grew because we bought complicated obligations others ignored and helped viable companies repair operations. The pattern was familiar. Someone else created the damage, then assigned me responsibility for preventing consequences. Competence had always been used as a reason to demand more from me. I had confused being dependable with being endlessly available. That day forced me to see the difference, and once I saw it, I could no longer return to the role they had prepared for me. To Preston, wealth existed only when displayed where he could rank it. I paid myself conservatively, reinvested profits, and avoided press. The consequence was not immediate, which made the waiting difficult. People who rely on pressure often interpret delay as victory. They become careless, repeat false claims, and commit themselves to details they cannot later reconcile. I let time do that work. Every additional explanation created another point that could be compared with the documents already in my possession. I relied on bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character felt practical rather than imaginary. His second company, ArcLight Home, expanded through luxury stores financed by short-term loans. There was nothing cinematic about my response. I went home, opened a notebook, and began arranging what I knew. Dates created a spine, receipts and messages added weight, memory supplied context, but I refused to rely on memory alone. I wanted a version of events that would remain true even when affection, embarrassment, and family pressure tried to soften it. Preston responded by opening more locations so growth could hide the problem. Revenue looked impressive, but returns, inventory costs, and lease guarantees weakened cash flow. I began noticing who asked how I was and who asked only what I planned to do. The difference separated concern from strategy. Some people wanted reconciliation before accountability because conflict made them uncomfortable. Others quietly offered dates, copies, or memories that helped. I stopped counting neutrality as kindness. In a dispute built on erasure, refusing to look usually protects the person holding the match. The trail through bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements became a structure strong enough to protect the financial independence I had built quietly. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Our mother asked me to review ArcLight's statements after Preston requested a loan against her home. People often imagine betrayal as one loud discovery. Mine arrived as a sequence of small contradictions, a changed time, a missing page, a casual sentence that did not match the previous one. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed alone. Together, they formed a design. Recognizing that design was painful, but it also ended the exhausting work of pretending everything might still be accidental. I advised her not to sign and offered to help Preston approach creditors honestly. I found supplier arrears, personal expenses charged to the company, and covenant breaches concealed through delayed invoices. Professional advice gave names to behavior I had experienced only as confusion: misrepresentation, coercion, concealment, retaliation. The words were not magic, but they organized the chaos. Once conduct had a name, it could be answered through a process rather than another circular argument. That shift returned energy I had wasted trying to make unreasonable people admit they were being unreasonable. Whenever explanations shifted, bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. He told the family I was jealous and too financially unstable to understand entrepreneurial risk. I slept badly afterward, replaying every decision that had brought me there. Shame tried to persuade me that I should have predicted the harm sooner. By morning, I understood that trust was not the mistake. The mistake belonged to the person who had treated trust as an unlocked door. That distinction gave me enough steadiness to take the next practical step. The invented loan became accepted because it matched the role he had assigned me. He said my refusal proved I resented his success and implied I had asked him for money before. I checked the original source whenever possible. Screenshots could be edited, stories polished, and partial documents arranged to create a false impression. Originals carried metadata, handwriting, sequence, and context. The more closely I examined them, the less power the public version held. Truth was not louder, but it was denser. It connected in ways invention could not sustain. I preserved bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase the financial independence I had built quietly. I kept going with one standard in mind: protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. I preserved every message and stopped discussing his company socially. The people around me preferred an emotional explanation because emotion could be questioned. Records were less cooperative. A timestamp did not care who was charming. A signature did not become authentic because relatives wanted peace. A financial transfer did not turn into generosity when described at dinner. I began separating what could be proved from what others merely hoped I would accept. The portfolio included Preston's company, although our acquisition team initially masked borrower names to prevent conflicts. Weeks later, ArcLight's primary bank sold a package of troubled loans to Harbor Slate through a competitive process. My instinct was to protect innocent people from the fallout, even when that protection might also shield the person responsible. I had to distinguish compassion from concealment. Compassion helps someone survive a consequence. Concealment prevents the consequence from arriving. I could offer the first without participating in the second, and that became the line I used in every decision afterward. The evidence in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. When compliance revealed the connection, I disclosed it to our investment committee and recused myself from the purchase decision. For years, I had measured strength by how much discomfort I could absorb without inconveniencing anyone. That definition served everyone except me. Real strength, I discovered, sometimes looked like refusing the emergency, declining the invitation, or letting another adult meet the consequence attached to a choice. It felt unnatural at first because healthy boundaries often feel cruel to people trained by unhealthy expectations. I retained no power to punish Preston through a private decision. Independent directors approved the acquisition because the underlying stores could survive under disciplined restructuring. The old version of me would have accepted a private compromise and called it peace. I now understood that secrecy was part of the mechanism. A private settlement without correction would leave the lie available for future use. I did not need public humiliation, but I did need the official record to reflect what happened. Accuracy was not revenge. It was the end of enforced confusion. I learned to trust the connections inside bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Harbor Slate became ArcLight's senior secured lender after closing. No single piece of information changed everything. The change came from accumulation. One document supported another. One witness explained a gap. One inconsistency made the next question unavoidable. I stopped asking whether the truth was dramatic enough and focused on whether it was complete. Completeness became my protection against a story designed to survive through exhaustion. He assumed his relationship manager still controlled the outcome. Preston received formal notice, but focused on the servicing bank's name and never read the page identifying the investment vehicle. Small acts of preparation began changing how I carried myself. I stopped flinching at urgent messages. I read documents twice. I asked for requests in writing. The people pressuring me described this as hostility because informality had always favored them. Structure felt aggressive only to those who depended on blurred boundaries. To me, it felt like air entering a room that had been closed for years. With bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect the financial independence I had built quietly. Every boundary became part of protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. The bank scheduled a restructuring meeting at the Belmere Club on the same day our family gathered there for our mother's birthday. I kept my plans private. The people who had underestimated me were comfortable because they mistook quiet for surrender. They expected either tears they could criticize or anger they could use as proof. I gave them neither. I gave myself time, professional advice, and permission to make decisions without announcing them to anyone who had already shown contempt for my interests. He invited several relatives into the private dining room before the bankers arrived. Preston placed both events near each other because he believed visible busyness reinforced his image. I grieved while I worked. Those activities can exist together. I could miss the person I believed someone was while protecting myself from the person their choices revealed. I could remember good years without allowing those memories to cancel present evidence. Holding both truths was harder than choosing either denial or hatred, but it left me with a future not organized around resentment. The growing file of bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character, became a series of ordinary decisions. During lunch, an aunt asked why I had not joined the family's planned Mediterranean trip. The hardest part was not gathering information. It was releasing the fantasy that the right evidence would restore the relationship I thought we had. Evidence could establish facts and shape consequences, but it could not manufacture remorse. Accepting that limitation kept me from bargaining away my safety in exchange for an apology someone offered only when every other option had failed. He added details about imaginary credit card debt while I watched people accept concern performed as humiliation. Preston answered that he had stopped subsidizing me and said I was nearly broke after a bad investment. When the pressure increased, I returned to the simplest question. What would I advise a stranger with the same facts? Distance made the answer obvious. I would never tell another woman to surrender records, money, work, or safety merely to prove she loved people who had already used love as leverage. I began offering myself the same basic loyalty I would have offered anyone else. I treated bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Bank manager Elena Ward entered carrying the restructuring binder and heard the final sentence. By then, I understood that dignity is rarely recovered through a perfect speech. It returns through repeated choices. I answered only what required an answer. I stopped defending facts that were already documented. I allowed silence to remain in rooms where I had once rushed to make everyone comfortable. The balance of power changed before anyone else was willing to name it. The room became quiet before anyone fully understood why. She apologized for interrupting, addressed me by my title as managing partner, and requested my signature on the conflict protocol. The turning point came quietly. I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to protect what mattered. Approval from the people benefiting from my silence was never going to arrive. I made the necessary call, signed the necessary form, and accepted that being misunderstood was less dangerous than remaining available for the next violation. What I could establish through bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Elena explained only what confidentiality allowed. Harbor Slate was the authorized decision-maker for ArcLight's senior debt, and the meeting could not proceed without our governance approval. What happened next looked sudden to outsiders, but it had been built through years of preparation. Skills gained in ordinary jobs, friendships maintained without advantage, and records kept when no one expected them to matter, all converged. The same people who had mistaken patience for passivity discovered that patience can also be a method of becoming impossible to corner. The correction was devastating because it remained narrow, professional, and impossible for Preston to dismiss as boasting. She did not reveal my personal finances. Later, people called the result inevitable. It was not. The result depended on small choices made while I was tired and afraid. Keeping a receipt, saving a message, asking one more question, refusing to sign. Justice often looks obvious only after someone has completed the invisible labor of making denial impossible. The discipline of maintaining bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements kept the financial independence I had built quietly from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Preston accused me of secretly buying his company to control him. I was tempted to make the outcome personal. A part of me wanted the people who had diminished me to feel exactly what I had felt. But imitation would have kept them at the center of my life. I chose a cleaner form of justice. Accurate facts, consistent rules, and consequences I did not need to exaggerate. Reality was sufficient once it was finally allowed into the room. His company had entered the package because of its own defaults. The portfolio records showed the deal had been sourced months earlier, priced by an independent team, and approved while I was recused. That experience changed my idea of winning. Winning was not watching another person suffer. It was reaching a morning when their choices no longer determined the temperature of my day. It was having work, relationships, and a home that did not require me to shrink. The formal outcome mattered, but freedom was the part no order or judgment could award on my behalf. By following bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. I left the family lunch and joined the formal meeting with outside counsel present. The next development forced me to separate surprise from disbelief. Surprise passes when new information arrives. Disbelief keeps bargaining with information already present. I had spent too long bargaining. I read the facts in their plainest order and stopped inventing gentler motives simply because the real ones made me uncomfortable. He could retain a minority interest if he cooperated. Harbor Slate offered a restructuring plan that preserved profitable stores, closed failing locations, replaced personal expenses, and required Preston to step aside as chief executive. I created a separate chronology for decisions still ahead. It listed what I knew, what remained uncertain, and which uncertainty actually mattered. The exercise prevented unanswered questions from becoming excuses for inaction. I did not need to solve every mystery before protecting myself from the facts already established. I returned to bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Preston refused and threatened bankruptcy, believing the family name would force the bank to renegotiate. I noticed how quickly people reached for my history when they could not answer my evidence. Old mistakes, old loyalties, and old insecurities were introduced, as if they changed the current facts. I refused the detour. A person can be imperfect and still be correct about what happened, and I no longer allowed unrelated flaws to become a license for mistreatment. Bankruptcy could restructure the company, but would not restore the image he had financed with concealed obligations. Elena showed him personal guarantees he had signed for several leases and a warehouse loan. The next conversation was shorter because I no longer filled silence with concessions. I stated the necessary point, requested a written response, and ended the exchange. Removing performance from conflict made the remaining issue easier to see. The clearest protection remained in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. He tried to persuade our mother to inject home equity money before the next covenant deadline. The situation also revealed the cost of delayed boundaries. Every exception I had made to preserve calm had taught someone that persistence could overcome my refusal. I could not repair that lesson with another explanation. I repaired it by making the boundary predictable, written, and unaffected by the volume of the response. She declined in writing and froze a line of credit Preston had accessed with an old authorization. I arranged independent counsel for her and provided the same statements I had reviewed earlier. I asked a professional to test my assumptions rather than merely confirm them. Where the evidence was weak, we labeled it weak. Where another explanation remained possible, we preserved that possibility. Careful limits increased credibility and kept me from becoming attached to claims the record could not support. I kept bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved the financial independence I had built quietly. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Family members began asking whether I was secretly richer than Preston. There were days when progress looked like nothing more than not making the wrong call. I did not answer while angry, surrender while tired, or sign while rushed. Those absences were decisions. They created the space in which a better option could remain available long enough for me to recognize it. I explained that financial privacy was not evidence of failure, and visible spending was not proof of security. I refused to provide a number because replacing his hierarchy with mine would preserve the same unhealthy question. Several documents arrived out of order, but their metadata restored the sequence. Creation dates, account numbers, and version histories exposed revisions that polished narratives had concealed. Details no one expected a reader to notice became anchors for the entire timeline. Each review of bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Preston leaked a story claiming a predatory fund controlled by his sister was destroying a family business. I began treating credibility as something demonstrated through behavior rather than claimed through tone. Calm people could lie. Emotional people could tell the truth. The useful question was whether a statement remained consistent with records and later conduct. That standard protected me from charm without requiring me to distrust everyone. Supplier lawsuits and lease notices supported the timeline. A trade reporter requested the restructuring history and discovered ArcLight had missed payments before Harbor Slate purchased the loans. I made practical plans for more than one outcome. That reduced the power of threats based on uncertainty. If the best result failed, I still had housing, work, support, and a lawful next step. Contingency planning turned fear from a wall into a set of doors. I relied on bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character felt practical rather than imaginary. Our fund released a standard statement describing the independent conflict process and employee protections. As the timeline grew clearer, several memories changed meaning. Comments I had dismissed as jokes now looked like testing. Sudden emergencies looked like rehearsals for later pressure. I resisted the temptation to rewrite every good memory as false. The past was complicated, but complication did not require me to deny the pattern visible in the present. The facts about governance mattered more than the satisfaction of publicly correcting a sibling. We did not mention the lunch or Preston's comments. The emotional requests intensified as the formal options narrowed. I answered compassionately without changing the underlying position. Kindness did not require inconsistency, and a boundary did not become punishment merely because someone disliked meeting it. The trail through bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements became a structure strong enough to protect the financial independence I had built quietly. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. ArcLight filed for court-supervised restructuring after Preston rejected the voluntary plan. The people responsible expected my empathy to weaken my position. They knew I could imagine fear, debt, ambition, and shame from another person's perspective. What they misunderstood was that understanding a motive does not erase agency. I could recognize why someone made a choice and still refuse to carry the consequence. The judge required separation of personal and business expenses before approving continued financing. Under oath, he listed cars, club dues, travel, and a condominium as company benefits essential to branding. One witness remembered a detail everyone else had overlooked. It did not decide the matter alone, but it connected two records previously treated as separate. I documented the recollection promptly and let the appropriate process determine its weight. Whenever explanations shifted, bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. An examiner found that Preston had shifted inventory among stores to record the same merchandise as multiple sales. I allowed myself one evening to feel the full insult of it. I did not convert the feeling into a message or decision. I walked, cried, and let anger complete its honest work of showing me where a boundary had been crossed. The next morning, I could act without asking anger to design the outcome. His reputation as a visionary had been supported by accounting choices staff repeatedly warned him to stop. The practice inflated lender reports without producing cash. I reviewed my own conduct with the same seriousness I expected from others. Where I had made assumptions, I corrected them. Where my language had been sharper than necessary, I acknowledged it. Accountability strengthened my position because it was a practice, not a weapon reserved for opponents. I preserved bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase the financial independence I had built quietly. I kept going with one standard in mind: protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Harbor Slate provided financing conditioned on an independent chief executive and protection for employee wages. Each new fact narrowed the space available for coincidence. The explanation now required too many unrelated accidents, all benefiting the same person and all disadvantaging me. Probability became its own form of clarity. I stopped apologizing for recognizing a pattern that had been carefully created. Preston lost operational control, but retained a smaller stake after contributing proceeds from personal asset sales. The court approved the plan because liquidation would have destroyed more value. The official process imposed deadlines that emotion had never respected. Claims required support, responses required consistency, and delay carried defined consequences. Structure did not guarantee justice, but it removed many hiding places. The evidence in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. He blamed me until the examiner produced emails showing he had ordered the reporting changes before our fund became involved. I changed my routines before I changed my public position. Access was reviewed, important papers moved, and private conversations limited. These choices looked excessive only if the threat was imaginary. Once the records confirmed intent, basic preparation became an ordinary expression of self-respect. I asked them to correct it in the same rooms where they had shared it, and only some were willing. Several relatives who had repeated his story apologized privately. I declined invitations to discuss the matter through intermediaries carrying incomplete messages. Triangles had kept our conflicts alive for years. Direct written communication reduced misunderstanding and prevented each person from editing the exchange for a different audience. I learned to trust the connections inside bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. The new management team closed 6 stores, renegotiated leases, and focused on a profitable online division. A few people surprised me by telling the truth when doing so offered them no advantage. Their honesty did not solve the dispute, but it reminded me that loyalty and integrity were not opposites. The healthiest support came from people who did not ask me to distort facts in order to prove affection. Employees kept their jobs because restructuring treated the business as something separate from Preston's performance of success. Within 18 months, ArcLight returned to positive cash flow. Money became easier to discuss once every amount had a source and date. Vague phrases such as family help, shared sacrifice, or business necessity dissolved when compared with transfers and balances. Precision returned moral weight to choices that euphemisms had tried to make harmless. With bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect the financial independence I had built quietly. Every boundary became part of protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Preston sold the club membership and moved from his penthouse into a smaller rental. The pressure campaign depended on speed. Urgent calls arrived before documents, emotional appeals before complete explanations, and deadlines before independent advice. I slowed every step down. Time was not avoidance. It was the condition required for informed consent. He began consulting for founders under supervision from the restructured board. None of those changes made him poor, but they removed the scenery that had allowed him to mistake spending for authority. I protected time for ordinary life while the dispute continued. I worked, cooked, slept, and answered friends about subjects unrelated to the crisis. Refusing to let the conflict occupy every hour was not denial, it was practice for the life I intended to have afterward. The growing file of bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character, became a series of ordinary decisions. Our mother asked why I had never told her the scale of Harbor Slate. I learned to recognize false balance. One person had acted, another had discovered it, yet observers described both as equally responsible for the conflict. That framing rewarded the original act and punished the refusal to conceal it. I would discuss my response honestly, but I would not accept half the blame for a choice I did not make. She admitted that she had mistaken Preston's visibility for competence and my quiet for need. I said privacy protected my judgment and prevented family expectations from becoming investment criteria. A proposed compromise solved the visible emergency while preserving the mechanism that created it. I rejected it for that reason. A durable solution had to change access, authority, or accountability, not merely postpone the next demand. I treated bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not. Protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. I created a written family policy refusing loans, guarantees, or investments without independent advice. The truth did not need me to sound invulnerable. I could admit fear, grief, and uncertainty without weakening the facts. In fact, releasing the performance of perfect strength made my decisions more accurate. I asked for help where I needed it and kept responsibility where it belonged. Consistency turned a personal boundary into something harder to negotiate through guilt. The policy applied to everyone, including me. I noticed that my body recognized danger before my thoughts admitted it. Tight shoulders, shallow sleep, and the urge to check messages constantly all eased when communication moved into formal channels. Safety became measurable in ordinary physical ways. What I could establish through bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Harbor Slate's investors later reviewed the conflict file and confirmed that every material decision had been made by independent directors. Soon, the dispute reached people who knew none of us personally. Their distance felt frightening at first, then relieving. They were interested in authority, dates, duties, and documents rather than family roles or social rank. The questions became narrower, and the answers became harder to manipulate. Professional distance preserved the very success Preston once believed I needed to advertise. The audit protected the fund from any suggestion that a family dispute had influenced valuation or enforcement. The most useful allies did not promise victory. They explained risk, documented options, and told me when my preferred interpretation exceeded the evidence. Their honesty made them trustworthy in a way unconditional agreement never could. The discipline of maintaining bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements kept the financial independence I had built quietly from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Elena later told me the lunch correction was the most uncomfortable sentence she had delivered in 20 years of banking. I stopped rehearsing the speech that would finally make everyone understand. Understanding was not a prerequisite for protection. Some people would continue preferring the version that demanded least from them. My task was to make sure their preference could not control the formal outcome. Dignity returned more fully through restraint than it would have through a speech about my net worth. I thanked her for stating only what the meeting required. Once the central facts were accepted, the remaining arguments shifted toward intent. I understood why. People often hope a sympathetic motive will cancel an objective act. Motive can shape consequence, but it cannot make an unauthorized signature, transfer, or decision disappear. By following bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. My rich brother told everyone I was broke because he needed my smaller life to prove his larger one was successful. The emerging consequences were created by the original choices, not by my decision to document them. I repeated that distinction whenever guilt arrived. A smoke alarm does not start the fire, and the person who calls for help does not create the damage responders uncover. She revealed the only fact that mattered that day. He had misunderstood who held power because he had confused appearance with ownership. The bank manager corrected the claim without comparing our balances. I prepared for the formal meeting by arranging the story around verified events rather than emotional importance. The most painful moment was not always the legally relevant one. Respecting that difference allowed the decision-maker to see the pattern without being asked to carry my entire grief. I returned to bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. Years later, Harbor Slate sold its ArcLight position at a reasonable profit after the company stabilized. For the first time, I could imagine an ending that was not reconciliation or destruction. There was a third possibility: accurate distance. We could occupy the same history without sharing access, and I could release the argument without surrendering the record. Wealth felt most secure when it no longer needed an audience. I directed my share of performance compensation into the pension accounts that had originally funded our strategy and a program teaching employees how to read equity offers. When a fair opportunity for resolution finally appeared, I evaluated it against the future rather than the insult. I asked whether it restored resources, corrected the record, and reduced the chance of repetition. Satisfaction mattered less than stability. The clearest protection remained in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. At our mother's next birthday, we ate at her kitchen table and paid for our own meals from a local restaurant. The result began taking shape through ordinary procedures rather than dramatic revelation. Notices were delivered, accounts reconciled, and statements compared. That quiet machinery mattered because it gave the truth somewhere to go after private appeals had failed. The conversation was not reconciliation, but it was the first one in years that did not require someone to be poor so another person could feel rich. Preston arrived without an announcement and asked about my work without guessing what it was worth. After the decision, I changed passwords and routines one final time, then stopped checking for new harm every hour. Protection that never allows vigilance to end becomes another kind of captivity. I wanted safeguards strong enough to let attention return to life. I kept bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved the financial independence I had built quietly. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character. I did not leave the experience unchanged. I became slower to confuse familiarity with safety and less willing to treat urgency as authority. That was not cynicism. It was the discipline of making room for facts before surrendering the financial independence I had built quietly. The official record eventually became shorter than the years leading to it. A few pages contained dates, findings, and consequences. What those pages could not show was the private work required to stop organizing my life around my brother Preston. People sometimes asked whether I felt vindicated. The word suggested a single satisfying moment, but recovery was quieter. It arrived when I could think about the future without first calculating how my brother Preston might react. I kept copies of bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements in one secure place and stopped carrying them through every ordinary day. Evidence had completed its job. I was allowed to build a life in which protection existed without constant vigilance. In the end, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character required more courage than any public confrontation. It meant refusing to become a mirror of the behavior that hurt me. I could insist on consequence without making cruelty my inheritance. The people who had watched from a distance preferred to describe the ending as a reversal of fortune. That description missed the years of work between injury and consequence. Nothing had turned by magic. I had simply stopped donating my silence, labor, and doubt to a version of events that protected my brother Preston. I also learned that an accurate ending does not require every relationship to be repaired. Some connections became smaller, some disappeared, and a few became more honest after access was no longer automatic. Loss remained loss, but it no longer had authority over the financial independence I had built quietly. Looking back, the decisive moments were rarely the loudest ones. They were the mornings when I preserved one more file, asked for one more explanation in writing, or declined to solve a crisis I had not created. Those choices accumulated until protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character was no longer an idea, but the shape of my daily life. I did not tell the story to prove that patience always wins. Patience without action can become permission. What protected me was patient action, checking bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements, seeking advice, and choosing a response that would still make sense after the immediate anger passed. There are parts of the experience I still dislike remembering. Healing did not turn betrayal into a useful gift, and success did not make the original harm necessary. I grew because I worked to recover, not because my brother Preston secretly taught me a lesson I should be grateful to receive. The future became ordinary again in the best possible way. I made plans without building them around another person's emergency. I spent time with people who could hear no without treating it as abandonment. The protection of the financial independence I had built quietly stopped feeling like a battle and became part of how I lived. If I had one truth to give the person I was at the beginning, it would be this: evidence is not cold, boundaries are not cruelty, and refusing to carry another adult's consequence is not revenge. Those tools made room for protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character when promises and apologies could not. Eventually, I could hold the whole history without needing to change its ending in my imagination. The facts were established, the consequence belonged where it fell, and my attention was free to move elsewhere. That freedom was the outcome I had wanted long before I knew how to name it. Time did not erase what happened, but it changed the scale. What once filled every thought became one completed part of a much larger life. I could remember my brother Preston without immediately returning to the moment when the financial independence I had built quietly seemed most vulnerable. The final proof was not contained in bank mandates, ownership filings, loan documents, and audited statements. It appeared in my habits. I no longer apologized for careful questions, confused pressure with love, or waited for an unfair person to approve my boundary. The documents had secured the record. Living differently secured the future. I moved forward without declaring the past forgiven or unforgiven. Those labels mattered less than the practical truth that it no longer governed my choices. In that quiet independence, protecting my work without using wealth as a substitute for character became something I could continue long after the formal dispute ended.